God bless Tiny Tim. It's definitely important for pop musicians to be recognizable. I think everyone would agree with that. Falling in line with trends and musical styles that other musicians were doing before you, or that other musicians are doing better than you, is basically a one-way trip to obscurity. In theory, at least. At some point, though, sounding too different from your contemporaries becomes a gimmick, which does often have a certain negative connotation to it. And I'm not really sure where that line is, like the line between stylistic choice and gimmick, but I think I can recognize a gimmicky act when I hear one. And I enjoy a good gimmick, possibly to a fault sometimes, but entertainment is entertainment, and I am easily entertained. Of course, the best musical gimmicks are the ones that are backed up by good performances and authenticity and all that. And even with all that, successful gimmicks can lead to obscurity as well after any short-term viral popularity wears off. This, unfortunately, describes the career arc of Tiny Tim, an act that exemplifies the term gimmick. And it's an act I happen to love. This is Tiny Tim's first LP, called God Bless Tiny Tim, which is a heck of an album title. A childhood heavily influenced by early 20th century pop music and well over a decade of trying to break into the music industry culminated in this wonderful album. For real, this album is so fascinating. Before doing this video, I considered it to be a good album, one that I really enjoyed. After doing all the research into this album and kind of digging into Tiny Tim's influences, it has shot up the ranks. It's definitely one of my favorite albums. The album art is a little strange, I suppose. Unconventional. Tiny Tim is definitely no stranger to the unconventional. Tiny Tim is sheepishly standing on this hill with his ukulele looking very gentle giant-ish. Yeah, the Tiny moniker is ironic. He was like 6'1". And his name's not even Tim. It's Herbert Corey. What else is he lying about? I like this album art a lot. Mostly it's because of how gaudy it is. The weird, distracting, psychedelic background. You got those stylish block letters. These low-res cherubs that are kind of strewn about. And of course you have the picture of Tiny Tim, which seems kind of like awkwardly plopped in the middle. All that being said, I think it's really funny and it would definitely catch your eye at a record store. I have the 50th anniversary reissue from 2018 and I really dig the look of the record itself. I'm a sucker for like color discs and picture discs and all that. Now we have to talk about the back of the album because, well, just look at it. Yeah, soak that in. I don't really get what happened. Like, the front is all whimsical and carefree, and the back is, like, almost menacing. Is he shushing me? We have Ed Thrasher to thank. He was in charge of art direction on this album. You know, one thing I'm noticing as I dive into album credits more and more for these videos is that I see certain names very frequently within certain time periods and genres. Ed Thrasher is one of those names. He was responsible for art direction on Jimi Hendrix's albums, a handful of Beach Boys albums, Van Dyke Parks, some Neil Young records, Doobie Brothers, I could go on. Van Morrison, Captain Beefheart, members of the Rat Pack. And I think this is the creepiest thing he's ever done. Richard Perry did the production of the album. He's also known for his production work with Captain Beefheart, Ringo Starr, Pointer Sisters, and Harry Nilsson, among many others. And Artie Butler is credited for the instrumental arrangements on the album. I didn't recognize his name at first, but it turns out he was involved in some notable pop hits from the 60s and 70s. This album also features instrumentals from members of the Wrecking Crew, just like so many other great 60s pop albums. I do plan on covering the Wrecking Crew in a video, but in the meantime, check out the 2008 documentary called The Wrecking Crew. It's very informative and kind of sheds light on what it was like to be an in-demand session musician in the 60s. Right, so what exactly do we have here? I mentioned that Tiny Tim was heavily influenced by early 1900s pop music, and that is mostly what we have here. It's like covers of old pop songs, except sort of modernized and with Tiny Tim's whole thing, which I'll get into. So let's take a dive right into Tiny Tim's dream, shall we? Haha! I'm cutting that out. I think this is a wonderful song to open the album. It was originally written by Jimmy Van Heusen for Bing Crosby in 1946. A young Herbert Corey grew up during basically the peak of Bing Crosby's career, and a lot of his childhood was spent listening to his records. Opening the album with this song is sort of like a shout out to one of Tiny Tim's biggest influences. And Tiny Tim adapts this song as an introduction to his own dream. His dream of recording his first LP. Yeah, it's delightfully meta. This song introduces one notable aspect of Tiny Tim's vocal delivery, which is his impressive ability to control his vibrato, referring to the rapid vocal pitch variation that sort of serves to add texture to the vocal lines here. A vibrato so intense that Bing Crosby himself once said,
"Boy, you could throw a Labrador through that vibrato of yours."
Whatever that means. After the a cappella performance of the song, the vocals give way to misty, flowing instrumentals, mimicking the feeling of entering this dream. Are you excited to get sucked into Tiny Tim's head? Oh, well, it's too late to back out now, so buckle up. And take notes, because there might be a quiz at the end. This is Tiny Tim's most popular song, and it's the one that people are going to be familiar with the most in general. It peaked at number 17 on the Billboard Hot 100 after Tiny Tim performed it live on the very first episode of Laugh-In. Tiptoe Through the Tulips, which is kind of hard to say, was written in 1929 by Al Dubin and Joe Burke, and it was originally performed by guitarist Nick Lucas. The original recording was an instant hit and stayed at number 1 for 10 weeks. And from what I've gathered, this song was all over the airwaves for a good bit of 1929 and into the 30s. It was covered by several pop artists after the release of the original recording. Like, I'm pretty sure multiple versions of the song were on the radio rotation at the same time. And a rendition of Tiptoe Through the Tulips was featured on the very first episode of Looney Tunes in 1930. It's a really cute sketch called Sink It in the Bathtub. But skipping ahead to 1968, Tiny Tim used this song as an opportunity to show off his falsetto and his trusty ukulele. His recognizable high register, almost effeminate singing was also accompanied by cartoony, simple backing instrumentals on the song. Tiny Tim's falsetto, in conjunction with his large stature and kind of his strange on-stage mannerisms, is what really solidified him as a pop culture figure. People at the time just could not believe that a man that looked like this could produce sounds like that. But this song really does remind me of like an old school Looney Tunes sketch, like where musical notes are dancing around my head and inanimate objects are following me around and everything is singing somehow. It's really sweet and whimsical, almost childish, and that's going to be a recurring theme. Also, side note, I'm a bit conflicted on the cheeky use of this song in the horror movie Insidious. On one hand, I get the irony of using the song as a backdrop to like creepy shenanigans, but also like if a demon kid started playing Tiny Tim on my record player, I'd be cool with it. Honestly, I was too young to remember it clearly, but the first time I heard Tiny Tim's music was when I was about 5 or 6, and some of you are ahead of me, but this song was featured on the very first episode of SpongeBob SquarePants, which is a show that's had an enormous influence on my life. Tiny Tim's version of the song plays as SpongeBob rapidly makes Krabby Patties to feed a horde of anchovies that have descended on the Krusty Krab. It's a ridiculous scene in a ridiculous episode of a ridiculous TV show, and Tiny Tim's inclusion is very fitting. Speaking of ridiculous, this track opens with Tiny Tim expressing how happy he is to be recording an LP. Again, so meta. This song was written by Al Sherman and Al Lewis, and it was originally performed by Maurice Chevelier in the 1930 film Big Pond. And as with Tiptoe Through the Tulips, this song was also covered by a handful of artists in the same year it was released, including a notable rendition by Bing Crosby. The song is so fun. It's just a fun song about having fun, and that's fun. Also, shout out to all the weird auxiliary percussion. This is probably my favorite track on the album. Tiny Tim opens up this track by complimenting his backing band, who is doing a great job, admittedly, but again, so meta. This is essentially a concept album where like the concept is recording an album. He then gleefully announces that this song is going to be a duet, and in fact, the original version of the song, which was written in 1913 by Bobby Heath and Artie Lang, not that Artie Lang, was performed as a duet by Ada Jones and Bill Murray, not that Bill Murray. The original recording is a silly, vaudeville-esque, flirty dialogue between a man and a woman that kind of comes across a little creepy if you read the lyrics. But anyway, guess who Tiny Tim performs this duet with? It's Tiny Tim. He does both parts, showing off his vocal range by imitating the male and female vocal parts. It's quite something. Right, side note, while I was researching this song, I noticed that the Wikipedia article for God Bless Tiny Tim credits a Walter Heath and a John Lang for this song, but I think that's wrong. Those two songwriters worked together on a number of songs, but John Lang would have been 8 when this song was written in 1913, and I can't find any other songwriting credits attributed to Walter Heath before like 1945. So yeah, I use Wikipedia for research. Apologies to my high school teachers. I did submit an update for the page though. On secondhandsongs.com, which is a resource that I found myself using quite frequently for this video, Bobby Heath and Artie Lang are credited, which makes more sense given the timeline. It kind of showed me how easily history can be kind of lost or misreported over time. This is why Tiny Tim and other musical archivists like him are so important. You know, they collect this pop culture history and keep track of the influence that it had on modern pop culture. So people don't like totally forget, you know? This track is a comedy sketch. Writing credits go to a Norman Blagman, who had written a good number of pop songs in the 50s and 60s and was Tiny Tim's manager for some time before recording this album. You see, Tiny Tim had been trying to break into the music industry for quite some time before this album, like most of the 50s and the 60s. And he went through a number of managers in the process, Norman Blagman being one of them. So it's possible Norman wrote the song for Tiny Tim at some point and he wanted to include it on this album. I'm not sure. That being said, there is a small amount of controversy regarding who actually wrote this track. And honestly, I wouldn't want to take credit for it. The setup to this joke is that there's a viper who's kind of creeping around this dude and hissing and cackling and counting down the time until something happens. When the time is up, the viper reveals that he has come to vipe the windows. I suppose the delivery of the joke is pretty good. It's pretty creepy, with the Viper's speech sounding reverby and distant and the protagonist sounding legitimately freaked out in like a theatrical, flamboyant way, of course. It is a weird track. I'd say it doesn't fit on the album, but like, I don't know what my criteria would be. And then the track ends with a killer Hammond organ solo. That sound needs to come back ASAP. Seriously, name a cooler sound than a Hammond organ, besides a Mellotron string voice. The sick organ solo transitions into what is the most modernized song on the album so far, with the instrumentals and production drawing considerable influence from the contemporary psych rock scene. The lyrics fall in line with the growing anti-war sentiment of the 60s, which I find especially interesting because this song was written by Irving Berlin in 1914 in response to the start of World War I. The lyrics are kind of dark and pretty edgy. The song depicts a conversation between Satan and his son. Satan Jr. wants to go up to Earth because, you know, heck is a little too hot for him. In response, Satan Sr. says that his son can't go up to Earth because Earth is too dangerous because of all the wars and stuff. Well, it turns out that Irving Berlin was kind of roasted for this song as the American public sort of became more and more favorable of America's involvement in World War I. And he kind of tried to distance himself from the song, embarrassed that he'd written something so controversial. And that, strangely enough, resulted in a bit of a rivalry between Irving Berlin and Groucho Marx, of all people, during the height of the Vietnam War. Groucho, who was very much against the Vietnam War and considered this song by Irving Berlin to be prophetic, would perform the song in earnest as part of his live acts to kind of throw shade at Irving Berlin for trying to forget about the song. Essentially, Groucho was using an Irving Berlin song as an Irving Berlin diss track, which is like next level. But yeah, I think this song was a really good choice for this album because it combines Tiny Tim's traditional musical tastes and the pop culture trends of the 60s in a really clever way. And it's one of my favorite tracks on the album for that reason. This is the oldest song on the album, with the original recording taking place in 1903. I mean, we're firmly in like wax cylinder phonograph territory now. Radio was like barely a thing. And this is the kind of stuff that Herbert Corey grew up on, like super old phonograph records. In fact, singing along to these records is how he discovered his unique vocal abilities. The song was written by George Cohan and it was performed by Edward Favor. The lyrics of the song are focused around exaggerated ideas of happiness, being a millionaire mostly, with very dated, Gilded Age references to wealth, like owning Western Union and marrying Hetty Green. I like how Tiny Tim kind of took some liberties with the lyrics in his rendition. He updated some of the references. For example, he expresses his desire to marry Tuesday Weld, who was a popular actress in the 60s. I interpret this song's inclusion on the album to be a sort of self-aware and exaggerative statement of Tiny Tim's own lofty dreams of being a pop star. He also took some liberties with the song's intro, which is a reference to a song by Spike Jonze, that's the satirist, not the filmmaker, called Never Hit Your Grandma with a Shovel, which I think was originally recorded sometime in the 40s, but I'm having trouble confirming that because the song was officially released as part of a compilation well after Spike Jonze's death. Oh, and you shouldn't hit your grandma with a shovel because it makes a bad impression on her mind. I feel like this song kind of got lost in the shuffle of Tiny Tim's career because I don't see many references to it in discussions of like 60s psych pop and baroque pop. And it's a really good song. It's one of the few songs on the record that isn't a cover. It was written by Gordon Alexander, who would go on to release a single LP called Gordon's Buster. It's an interesting album, but ultimately just okay. The opening flourishes of this song kind of remind me of some like weird Willy Wonka-esque trip. Tiny Tim's layered and reverby vocals glide through the song over really pretty piano and string accompaniments, hitting pretty much every psych pop lyrical cliche I can think of. But yeah, this song is a hidden gem for sure. Even if you're not a fan of Tiny Tim's music, I think you should listen to this song. This fittingly titled song opens up side B, and I know that this is a significantly strange album, but this song is really out there. Right, so it opens up with Tiny Tim chuckling at something unknown. Maybe himself, maybe the audience. I have no clue what he's laughing at. And you know what? It might be better to just not know. But the laughing increases in volume and intensity, eventually verging on screaming, until he can finally calm himself down. And then the instrumentals kick in, and it's ironic how anachronistic this sounds because most of the songs here have been old pop tunes. But this part of the song, the verse, reminds me of something out of the 80s. I'm having trouble placing it, like Yellow or something, or like Kraftwerk without synths. I realize how idiotic that sounds. I don't know, it's been really bothering me, so if anyone can help out, that would be great. What does this sound like? But after the post-punk bit, there's a really echoey pre-chorus that kind of sounds like it was recorded underwater, and then it transitions into a chorus that's more conventional, for Tiny Tim at least. He is declaring that the ice caps are melting and the world is drowning. Yeah, this is an environmentalist song. It's sung from the perspective of a fish who is seeing cars and buildings and stuff in the water underneath him. Except the song seems really optimistic, as if the fish is kind of happy with the situation. It's a pretty interesting angle for an environmentalist song. But seriously, this song is off the wall. We have Bill Dorsey to thank for this little pocket symphony. And who is Bill Dorsey? Seriously, who is Bill Dorsey? I can't find much of anything about him other than some references for him writing for the 33 1/3 Revolutions per Monkey TV special. Supposedly, Bill Dorsey wrote this song for the Monkees for that TV special, but it didn't make the cut. But, supposedly again, he recorded it as a demo. This demo, supposedly, again, exists somewhere. I searched the darkest corners of the internet for this recording, and I could not find it anywhere. Obviously, it wouldn't have been as wacky and as entertaining as Tiny Tim's version, but still, I really want to hear it in its original state. The birds are coming, apparently. Tiny Tim felt the need to frantically repeat that over and over on multiple tracks to open the song. I can't explain it. Time out. If you're like not digging this album, or like if it makes you even feel a little uncomfortable at times, I get it. I get it. This album is not for everyone. If you do feel like that, I hope you can at least appreciate like the idea of the album, you know, as cliche as that sounds. You know, kind of shift focus to like the overarching themes here, like the unique blending of sincerity and satire, the self-awareness, and of course the references to old forgotten media. Even if that means putting the performances in the backseat. All right, time in. This song was apparently the B-side of the original release of the previously mentioned On the Old Front Porch, which is the 4th track on this album, although this song was performed by Eddie Morton. So it was like a split record, which I didn't realize existed in 1914, but I guess that makes sense. The instrumentals on Tiny Tim's version are a pretty interesting mix of traditional and modern, including an old-timey fiddle and a disgustingly distorted guitar in the same breath. There's nothing too impressive going on with this song, but you know, it's a fun little jaunt. This is another song that isn't a cover. It was written by a man named Artie Wayne, who had a relatively minor songwriting career, but that career included writing a song for Clint Eastwood called Cowboy Wedding Song. Clint Eastwood released an entire album of country music in 1962, by the way. This song sounds like a lullaby depicting a conversation between a boy and his father as they discuss death. Well, they're discussing what heaven is like. It sounds like the kid's mother died recently. His dad describes a very blissful and sugary afterlife, and the kid seems pretty into it. Like, really into it. Like, really into it. Like, he wants to go to heaven now. The vocal range on the song is incredible. He spans like 4 octaves between his dainty child voice and his Elvis-esque baritone. The intro riff to this song is an adaptation of Mysterioso Pitzicatto, also known as the Villain's Theme, which was written either by James Lamp or John Zamschneck, depending on who you ask. Either way, it gained popularity because it was part of a compilation of silent film accompaniment music released by James Lamp in 1914. And honestly, before now, I had just known this riff as the Strychnine Lick due to its inclusion in that song by the Sonics. Regarding the lyrics of the song, I'm not entirely sure what's going on. I know it's some sort of like welcome home party for our protagonist here. He goes around and greets the guests, but it kind of seems like he's not really feeling it because he kind of just dips without telling anyone. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, the villain's theme at the beginning might indicate that the protagonist is coming home from prison and he might have left to commit more crimes. This song is credited to 2 people, Diane Hildebrand and Jack Keller, who is looking pretty fresh. They had songwriting careers with several musicians, including the Monkees and Mama Cass. Honestly, who didn't write for the Monkees? I like this song a lot because it's the most Wrecking Crew-esque instrumental. It kind of reminds me of Pet Sounds era Beach Boys. The lyrics are pretty standard hippie fare about thinking good thoughts and good vibes and all that. And I like how Tiny Tim says this song is dedicated to everyone in the world. Like, can he do that? This song was written by Paul Williams and it was performed by Biff Rose originally in 1968. In addition to being covered on this album, it was also performed by David Bowie on his album Hunky Dory. Paul Williams, the songwriter here, would actually go on to have a very prolific career as a performer and a songwriter for David Bowie, the Carpenters, and he apparently did vocals on the song Touch off of Daft Punk's Random Access Memories. So there is, in fact, a direct connection between Random Access Memories and God Bless Tiny Tim. I hope that information is useful to you someday. Proto lo-fi indie jam coming in. Some people call Tiny Tim an outsider artist, and I think it's because of stuff like this. This is, of course, a cover of the Sonny and Cher song, I Got You, Babe. And I feel like Tiny Tim kind of snuck this song onto the album while no one was paying attention. It's just him and his ukulele having a wonderful time. His ukulele playing is somewhat crude, but his vocals are rather impressive, seemingly jumping between high and low parts with incredible vocal dexterity. But as the song ends, we learn that the two vocal parts were actually recorded on separate tracks as they overlap to canned applause. The end of this song is one of the funniest moments on the album. Written by Gordon Jenkins and beautifully performed by Nat King Cole in 1958. It's a really, really good selection to close this album out. See, Tiny Tim recorded this album when he was 35 years old, which, as I get older, seems like not that old, but it is pretty old for a new pop star that just broke, you know? The song is about growing old and still being able to keep a youthful energy. And if there was anybody who could hold on to youthful energy despite age, it was Tiny Tim. The lush instrumentals and Tiny Tim's elegant vocals transition into the same melody that marked the beginning of this wonderful dream of an album, as Tiny Tim thanks us for listening and bids us farewell. I think it's amazing that the more I listen to this record and the more I look into it, the more I like it. Usually when I do these videos, I listen to the same album over and over and over, and I get sick of it by the end. But that's not the case here. Tiny Tim was an anomaly. In my opinion, one of the most unique and intriguing pop artists of all time. He was immensely talented, and he never really got enough credit for that. I think his ultimate goal was to express his love for the traditional pop of the early 20th century and sort of do his part in bringing that music back into relevancy. Well, he absolutely nailed the first part of that. The pure joy and enthusiasm expressed on this album, his subsequent albums, and his live performances is unmatched. His attempt to bring his favorite music back into the popular music conversation, I think, might have been doomed from the start. People just didn't seem as interested in Tiny Tim's musical tastes as they were in the way that he looked and sounded. And to be fair, he did lean into that in a very self-aware way. I mean, the dude was a frequent guest on Laugh-In, and he got married live on Johnny Carson. It's safe to say he was okay with being a spectacle. But it seems like people gradually stopped being shocked by his presence and his odd mannerisms, and his pop culture relevancy started to fade. That and some indie label that had recordings of Tiny Tim from all the way back in 1962 released them as an album called Concert in Fairyland right after God Bless Tiny Tim was released. Tiny Tim didn't have a say in it, and it's not a good album. His performances are shoddy, and there's like this extremely obnoxious and distracting canned applause throughout the entire album. Tiny Tim considered this the album that killed his career because a lot of intrigued record buyers thought this was a legitimate second Tiny Tim album, when really it was just a subpar, unethical cash grab from some insignificant record label. Tiny Tim would go on to release a second LP later in 1968, an actual second album. It was aptly titled Tiny Tim's Second Album. It didn't breach the Billboard charts, and I'm having trouble finding sales numbers on it. While not as good as his first album, in my opinion, I think it deserves some credit for being a pretty solid for a sophomore album. Also, this album features an interview of Tiny Tim by Tiny Tim. It's wild. But it wasn't a hit. He also released a collection of children's songs called For All My Little Friends, which was apparently nominated for a Grammy in 1970 for Best Children's Music. In the 70s, he would go on to release a few singles, including a satirical take on the late 70s oil crisis called Tiptoe to the Gas Pumps. But none of these records were anywhere close to being as popular as his 60s stuff. Oh, and he did a cover of Rod Stewart's Do You Think I'm Sexy on The Tonight Show in 1979. You should watch that right now because it's amazing. Other notable releases include include an outrageous album of rock songs called simply Rock, and a rager of a disco cover of They're Coming to Take Me Away, that novelty hit from Napoleon the 14th. Tiny Tim continued to tour into the 90s, performing fairly frequently despite declining health, a heart attack, and warnings from medical professionals, because nothing could stop this man from performing. While playing a concert on November 30th, 1996, Tiny Tim collapsed and he never regained consciousness. He died while singing Tiptoe Through the Tulips. His youthful energy and his love of performing was unfortunately limited by his body, although he got to go out doing something he loved, doing what he was truly born to do. And it might be presumptuous of me to say, but I think he was okay with that. In addition to highlighting the performances on this album, I wanted to kind of take a page out of Tiny Tim's own book and shed some light on the history of these old, mostly forgotten songs of the early 1900s. Hopefully you guys check out the original performances of these songs and get some value out of that. I'll leave links in the descriptions for the ones that I can find. I know that I have a newfound appreciation of the cultural impact of these songs that I didn't previously know anything about. I really enjoyed diving into the various rabbit holes that these songs opened up, and I have Tiny Tim to thank for that. God bless Tiny Tim. I understand that I can't do this album justice just by sitting here and talking about it, but I just wanted to bring it to your attention. Thanks for listening.